But let me give you just a little bit of background to what I'm going to share with you, just in terms of the journey that I've been on in the last 5-6 years as I've thought about some of this. And then it will hopefully allow you to particularize it into the situation that you're facing right now. I'm not an expert on any particular country, and so I'm always very hesitant about jumping in and trying to describe when you're coming from outside what it's like actually from the inside. But in terms of a global movement, we're in one of the most interesting cultural shifts that I think we've probably seen in, well, I would say not just in our lifetime, possibly in the last 400 to 500 years. And let me explain what I mean by that. About 5-6 years ago, I was giving some thought to some of the challenges that we were facing in UK and US culture. And I was very interested just in the rising sense of bitterness that there seemed to be just within the culture generally. And a little while later, a few months after, I was speaking at a major conference over in Asia with leaders from 18 different countries right across this region. And I gave an illustration of saying, here's what's happening in the West right now. And as soon as I'd finished that talk, I then got invitations from political leaders and CEOs of major corporations from every single country represented in the room to say, we're in exactly the same situation you just described. Will you come and speak in our country? Will you speak to our leaders, to the business leaders? So then I can remember thinking, clearly this isn't just sort of like a Western issue. Obviously, there's something happening in Asia too. Well, a few days later, I was back in my home, and a businessman from Africa was visiting the city at the time. He had done a lot of his business empire, I think, is meant to be like the 7th largest in the entire continent of Africa, something like that. And do you want to turn one of the lights off? We met for, we were meant to meet for half an hour, and 3.5 hours later, his response was, look, I need you to come and meet with me with the various heads of states right across Africa, because what you're describing is true for every country in Africa too. And it was interesting, having just been in South America, meeting with some of the Supreme Court Justice there, the president, various of the leaders, the CEO and the chairman of the largest single company in their entire economy, also addressing this issue, and hearing from other leaders who'd come from right across South America. You've just described exactly where we are. So one of the challenges of what I'm about to talk to you is that we're in a very unusual position globally, in that almost every country of the world that I've been to is wrestling with the same set of questions and the same set of struggles. Now that's very unusual. Having spent 23 years now crisscrossing across the globe and having spoken in so many different countries, normally as you move from one country to another, to another, to another, you find that there's this huge variation. So one of the questions I've been wrestling with, therefore, is how can so much of the world be locked into the same place at the same time? Now, the reason why it's an important issue is the issue that or the struggle or question I want to raise with you is one that can lead to huge global upset, and I'll come to that in a moment. But let me just start with, if I can, just a small phrase in the Old Testament that really jumped out to me as I was doing some research into this. In the book of Amos, there's a phrase where it talks about, is it possible for horses to run on rocky crags? And do you use the oxen to plow the ocean? But you have turned justice into bitterness, so all your righteousness tastes like poison fruit. And that phrase about turning justice into bitterness really grabbed me, because we live in a world right now where everyone is talking a lot about justice and what it looks like and the need for it, but most of the cries for justice that we have are bitter. So what the prophet is saying is, if the quest for justice is bitterness, even if you get what is just, you're still left with the bitterness at the end of it. Now, what that also means, therefore, if the quest for justice is love and compassion, when you get justice, what you're left with is love and compassion. And those two things work out very differently in any given society in the world. Now, the danger, therefore, is that with a bitter quest for justice, is that we fool ourselves into thinking when we get what is right, then everything will be okay. However, it's possible to pursue justice in a society whereby even if you get what is right, it's going to taste like poison to everybody else. In other words, you haven't united a society around the quest for justice, you've split it. Not because you were pursuing justice, but the manner in which it was pursued has actually caused the division. And that's now one of the biggest problems that we actually have. We live in a world where people feel justified to go to almost any length to get the right result, without them ever stopping to ask whether the means by which they're pursuing that justice could actually end up doing more harm than the original offense in the first place. Now, I want to be very, very clear. The Bible makes it painfully clear for Christians. The question is not whether we pursue justice. We're not even given that option. We have to pursue it, and we have to fight for it. For the defenseless, for the widow, for the poor, for the societies we're in, for the challenges we face, we are commanded to engage with that in a way to bring about justice. However, the motive by which we pursue justice, the Bible tells us, is just as important, and in some cases even more important than the pursuit of justice in and of itself. Now, I'm going to try and just unpack that just a little bit more, and then throw this open up for questions for all of you, because one of the next questions comes then twofold. Okay, if the quest for justice has become bitter, one, why is it such an important issue? And two, what does that actually mean for us today? How have we ended up there, and what can we do about it? So let's just deal with question number one first. Why is it such an important issue? Well, I don't know how much of you are familiar with European history, but let me give you a European story. Now, I was raised a lot of my life in the Middle East, but we've got 3,000 years of territorial war there. So the reason I'm picking a European one is so I can move from a point of peace to disruption more easily. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with a guy called Prince Lazar, but Prince Lazar was the ruler of Kosovo from the late 1200s into the early 1300s. He was a warrior figure. He adopted the title prince than any of the other titles that could have been given to him. And he was involved in a whole series of running battles in that part of the world. And he was killed during these battles. Now, depending whose history you read, he was either killed in prison, stabbed in the back, or he was killed on the battlefield. The people of Kosovo believed he'd been stabbed in the back in prison. They were very bitter and angry about the manner in which he had been killed. Now, because he was such a hero to the people, they wanted him buried in their home city of Kosovo. But because of the military instability and the political instability, he was buried outside of the city. Now, the people from that region, they sang songs about him. There were nursery rhymes about him. There were stories told about him. Actually, up until this day, some of those stories, some of those nursery rhymes are still repeated in that part of the world to this day. And from that day, that region, that part of that world defined itself as a nation in mourning. Now, there are a whole series of moves to try to get the body returned back to Kosovo. They all failed. In the late 1800s, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in charge of that part of the world, the Kosovans made a renewed plea to the emperor on the 500th anniversary of this guy's death to return him to the city so he could be buried. It was refused. Now, as they battled towards this 500th anniversary date, a young Kosovan decided that it was finally time, after 500 years of waiting for justice, 500 years of waiting for this body to be returned, that they needed to extract revenge. So a young Kosovan guy set out and assassinated the nephew of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and started the First World War. Some of these historical grievances run so deep and over such a period of time that they can actually plummet the entire world into chaos. As the 600th anniversary of the death of Prince Lazar loomed, the then leader of that part of the world, a guy by the name of Slobodan Milosevic, announced to the Kosovan people that if it was the very last thing he did, he would have the body returned and buried in the city. Well, they got the body returned. It was toured around the nation, every village, every town, every city. Everyone came up wearing black because they were a nation of mourners. They mourned the loss of Prince Lazar. A giant statue of him was erected in the capital. And almost 600 years to the day, the genocide in that part of the world began. These long-term, bitter struggles can have massive consequences for the entire world. That's why this issue is so important. Now, we're going to use a term which I really, really, really don't like. It's a term that came from psychology and social psychology, but we're now using it in sociology, and for that reason it doesn't translate very well, and it causes a lot of defensiveness, and ideally I'm looking for a whole new word, but I haven't been able to come up with one yet. But the psychologists would call this, in essence, what's called a victim mentality. A victim mentality is when you allow yourself to be defined by your historical grievances, where your historical grievances and pain and struggle, or your present grievances, pain and struggle, define who you are. And therefore, a violation of those things is a violation of your identity, of your worth, of who you are. And therefore, you are excused almost any form of measure to bring about the retribution you feel would finally bring you peace. Now, the reason psychologists would use this and talk about trying to get out of a victim mentality, because they could see the negative things that would happen. Now, the easiest way for me to explain this for you would be for you to imagine that that someone has done something wrong to you. For victim mentalities to prevail, you need real injustice. So we're not talking about pretend injustice or pretend wrongs or things that didn't happen that you think that happened. Sometimes people invent that stuff, that's true. But we're talking about real, deep pain. And the question is, how will you respond to the pain that I inflict on you? So let's supposing I were to publicly insult you and humiliate you. The question is, how do you respond? Now, in some cultures, you would respond very publicly and you would defend yourself, because that's what you're required to do. But you would have to do it in a way to defend your honor, which would mean you'd have to do it honorably, which means if I come after you and attack you, in an honor-based culture, when you're defending yourself, you have to defend yourself in a way in which itself is also seen to be honorable. So in other words, if you pay someone to come and be nasty to me and everybody finds out that's what happened, you lose status in that society. As a leader, you are demoted down. Everybody knows that I attacked you unfairly. You're not to blame, but the manner of your response wasn't worthy of someone who should be esteemed and looked up to. And secondly, you also have to do it in an honorable way. If I attack you and make you bitter in an unfair way, and you were to stand up and defend yourself and get angry and upset and yell and scream and so on, although people may understand why you feel that way, that's not an honorable response. You lost it, literally, in every sense of the word, and you lose your esteem as a result. That's not how we want to see our leaders act. Now, in dignity-based cultures, if I were to attack you, your response is going to look very, very different. In a dignity-based culture, if I attack you, so now you're the victim and I'm the person who did it, you may decide to say nothing about what I've done to you. You may be very quiet. You may quietly take me aside, talk to me. And if you can put things right and make peace with me, that would be seen as a dignified response. You conducted yourself with dignity, and you also defended yourself in a way that preserved your dignity. Now, those two responses, they can be perverted into something which is unhealthy, but there's also something within them which can be healthy. However, psychologists, when they talked about a victim mentality, they're talking about something very different. So let's supposing a truly terrible situation. I attack, beat you, and rape you. Now, when you go into counseling, traditionally, the counselors would try to go through a process with you. And at some point, they may well train you to say to yourself, I am not a victim. I am not a victim. Now, why would a counselor train someone who's been attacked and raped to say to themselves, I am not a victim? They're not trying to get the individual to deny the past. That's neither healthy nor helpful. They're not trying to tell the person it doesn't matter. Okay, just get over it. That's neither helpful nor going to do anything at all to help in that person's journey back. This event doesn't define you. You are more precious than this. You are more beautiful than this. You are more wonderful than this. There is more value to your life than this. You cannot allow this to define you. If you allow this, what happened to you, this massive injustice to define you, the person who did this to you not only wronged you in the past, they are continuing to steal from you in the present, and they'll also have control of your future. Don't give control of to that person of your present and your future. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, you give up the pursuit of justice. That doesn't mean you don't want to see that person pursued, punished, or any of those things. It does mean that inside, you no longer want to be controlled by what the Bible would call a root of bitterness. Now, in other words, don't fall into thinking like this. Because even if you're pursuing justice, but you're driven by bitterness, you're going to be imprisoned by it. Now, here's the challenge. We live in a global culture right today that celebrates the victim mentality. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, and I can unpack them for you a little bit more if you wish, but let me just jump into the media side, because the media side of things is just everywhere. Now, given the age of many of you in this room, I'm assuming, like me, you can remember the very first Superman movie that came out. Now, if you ask yourself, what were Superman's weaknesses? The answers are close to zero. Apart from kryptonite, he was perfect. Morally, perfect. Rationally, perfect. Emotionally, perfect. Kind, generous, thoughtful, understanding, caring, listening. He reminds me of me every time I think of him. And that is why he was a superhero. He was perfect. And he could fly. Therefore, someone to esteem to look up to want to be like. Have any of you seen Man of Steel, the 2011 remake? How does that movie begin? Well, Superman is lost on a boat in thick fog out at sea. He's wrestling with his sense of worth. He's wrestling with his sense of identity. He feels cosmically lonely, cosmically abandoned, left by his parents, left by his culture, unable to understand who he is, unable to process the weight of pressure put on his shoulders. Superman, to be a hero today, needs a victim narrative. I don't know how many of you watch Marvel movies, but every single Marvel superhero, all of them, have been used, abused, hurt, betrayed, abandoned. They all need a victim narrative to be a hero today. So the narrative we have today is in order to have status, you must be a victim. Therefore, you need to hold on to this historical pain, on to this injustice. And that explains why they can't form relationships. So classic movies about your hero figure, whether they're a superhero or normal hero, doesn't matter, male, female, when they finally find peace, when they finally overcome the bitterness, they can marry, settle down, have a family. How many movies end like that this day? There has to be an ongoing narrative, because once you've solved it, you've lost your sense of identity because you've wrapped yourself up into it. But that then means you believe the best way to pursue justice is by therefore stoking the sense of bitterness. In 1 Corinthians 13, you have this incredibly well-known passage. I remember when I first became a Christian, it was one of the first passages I memorized. I can remember I started memorizing verses. I have the strength to face all conditions by the power that Christ gives me, phrases like that. 1 Corinthians 13 was the first chapter of the Bible I ever memorized, and I'd only been a Christian for a week. And I went to my first at the Bible study, and the guy had decided to study 1 Corinthians 13 in this little Bible study group I just started. So I rather amazed this guy when he said, would anybody like to read the passage? And I said, yeah, sure, I will. Took the Bible, didn't look at it, and just recited it by heart, because I just spent 3 days learning it. And I've always been a bit intimidated by that passage because there's so much in it. I've always felt scared to preach from it. And so it was only fairly recently I actually felt I had the courage to teach from 1 Corinthians 13 in detail, because I thought there's just so much here I feel I need to understand better before I start to offer an explanation of it. But when I was speaking from it last year, I suddenly realized something that I'd never noticed before, even though for the last 4 or 5 years I've been doing some quite in-depth study through it. The way 1 Corinthians 13 starts is it talks about, well, first of all, that we have to have love. And then it goes and it says, look, if I can speak in the tongues of angels, but I do not have love, my voice is merely a clanging cymbal. Okay, and I have nothing. If I have all of the wisdom that this world affords, and all of the insight, and the kind of faith that can move mountains, but I don't have love, I gain nothing. If I give everything I have to the poor, complete 100% sacrifice of myself in service of others, but I have not love, it amounts to nothing. Now, what I realize is, because I hadn't paid particular attention to the passage close enough, I realized I was imagining it wrong. I realized that for the first 20 or so years of my Christian life, 30 years of my Christian life, what I'd imagined 1 Corinthians 13 was saying, you have some really hyper-spiritual people. They are very, very gifted, very, very impactful, but they're not very loving towards other people. And you look at them and you think, gosh, you've got so much. You've got so much to offer. You're like 80% of the way there. If we could just add a little bit of love to soften you up a bit, then it would complete the picture. Or you meet people who are utterly brilliant. I mean, so smart. I mean, I listen to some of my colleagues now talk on artificial intelligence. I feel artificially intelligent. Listen to them talk about artificial intelligence. They're genius. So you can look at people around the world and think, gosh, you're so smart. But you just don't love people. And if we could just add love to your character, it would close off the character. It would give you 100%. Or we look at people who are just out there serving. And it's hard sometimes not to get cynical when you're on the front line helping people day in, day out, wondering if anybody else notices or cares. So you can get a bit hard. And we see people who are serving in a huge way, and we think, you know what, if you were just loving and more kind to other people. So we think they've got 80% and they're missing 20%. That's not what that passage is saying at all. That 1 Corinthians 13 is saying, if you do all of these things but you don't have love, you don't have 80%, you have 0. You have nothing. You gain nothing. It amounts to nothing. It is nothing. Not something, not half of it, not a percentage of it, 0. In other words, if love isn't driving all of these things, it is nothing. The service, the leadership, the love, the sacrifice, the giving, the theology, the spiritual pursuit of God, the development of spiritual gifts, all of these are nothing without love. 0. In Galatians 5:8, it's very interesting. If I were to say to you, I want you to imagine a thoroughly uncompromised Christian. Imagine a Christian who refuses to compromise ever. Now, if you close your eyes, I'm not going to close my eyes, otherwise I'll fall asleep on my feet. But if you close your eyes and I say, I want you to imagine a Christian who never, ever compromises, what kind of image comes to your head? Well, normally it's someone who's quite hard, quite steely, quite strong, quite, Well, in the book of Galatians, in chapter 5, we're told what the fruit of the Spirit is. Love, peace, joy, patience. You know the list. So don't compromise on that. Be thoroughly uncompromised as a Christian in how you pursue and live these things. That's what an uncompromising Christian should look like.